In last week's video, I told you about the Kantha stitching workshop that I took during my trip to the UK last summer. And I also shared a fairly straightforward Kantha stitching project similar to this checkerboard pattern. And today I'd like to share with you something somewhat more complicated. That's why I'm calling this video a challenge. This particular stitch is a rather complicated way to approach the running stitch. But if you're up for a challenge, I think you'll enjoy it. And I'll also share with you more about Westdean, a place where you might encounter some dead animals on the wall or some original surrealist art. And this giraffe here was inspired by the head on the wall. Her name is Elsa, and she's named after Elsa Schiaparelli. And in fact, this lip chair by Salvador Dali and the former owner of the house, Edward James, was in fact made for Elsa Schiaparelli, who was a fashion designer back in the day. And that would be Edward the elephant there in his very own lip chair with a stiff upper lip. And the flamingo on the other side is named Tilly after his wife. And those are indeed her footprints on the staircase there. After their divorce, he had this carpet ripped out and replaced with a carpet with the footprints off his dog, who he said was more loyal than his wife. There is indeed much more to that story. And I'm going to share more about the Westdean story with my Ko-fi supporters at the end of this video. So if you're interested in learning more, I'd love to have you join us over there. There's a small subscription fee each month, but I always share a little bit of extra content, and my Ko-fi supporters always get early access to my videos as well. And what do you think of this Kantha stitch jacket that I'm wearing here? It's made with a similar zigzag pattern as what we're going to be doing in today's video. I've named this portrait here Lynn. I couldn't resist buying this book about Kantha, and my goodness, there are some really inspiring illustrations in this book. And I was rather amused to find this section because this Lynn, she was our instructor for the workshop that I did, and all those beautiful Kantha pieces she had brought as samples. Now let's do some Kantha stitching, shall we? My stitching for this week is going to be inspired by the Lips Sofa. And I'm going to stitch some lips roughly in this shape, most simple lips that people tend to draw, but I'm going to stitch them in a rather complicated zigzag type pattern. Now, it's not the easiest thing to do, and that's why I'm calling today's video a challenge. And while Elsa's chair was in a pink satin, I think I'm going to make mine juicy red lips. Oh, and if you notice that my fingers look like they're peeling, it's actually glue. I was working on this earlier in the day. So you may have noticed that one of the pieces that I made during the workshop is not exactly lying flat. So pro tip here, if you don't want your piece to pucker up, then work on a separate piece and then sew it down. And that's what I'm going to be doing. And I'm going to start by using this dark red thread and outline my lips. And I'm just doing it freehand without drawing the lines to follow on here, but there's absolutely no reason to not draw lines on here. And because this is Kantha stitching, I am using running stitch, but I'm going to do a double running stitch. So once I've gone all the way around with my dashed line, I'm going to go back along the same line and fill in all the blanks between the stitches. But you could absolutely do this with a back stitch or a stem stitch or any other stitch that you know. So you might notice that my stitches are a little bit rough, and I'm not going to worry about that at all. I can deal with that later on. But now what I want to do is I want to fill in the main part of my lips, and I've drawn that line there, but I don't think it was necessary in the end. And for this part, I'm going to use a slightly lighter version of the red. Lipstick is often like that. There's a dark outline and a lighter inside. And I'm going to start out right in the middle along that line that I drew, doing again just our basic running stitch, in, out, in, out, in, out. And then I'm going to work from the center there out out to either side. So my second row here, I'm going to start staggering the stitches so that they move at a diagonal, but then when I get to the middle section here, and I didn't plan this, but I conveniently used 5 stitches, I'm going to make this next stitch bigger on both sides. So in this half, the diagonal is going to be moving in the opposite direction. Now, if this is complicated for you to think about, then yes, don't do it. Just make your diagonals going in one direction. My pro tip here is do not start here. If you're not an experienced stitcher, do not start with this one. Start with something like this, rows of stitches stacked up to form a column, or perhaps staggered to make a checkerboard like this one. And once you've figured those out, you can move on to a diagonal in one direction or swapping going back and forth. And then you can start moving out in all directions at the same time. And now when I head back, I have to keep track of how my diagonals are moving. And then when I get to the middle, if I keep making that stitch bigger, it'll get really loose and unstable. So I'm going to split that into 2 stitches. One that is moving with the bottom half and one that moves with the top half. And then I'm just going to keep going back and forth, filling in those stitches fairly close together. I'm not going to worry about it if they're not perfectly aligned, but fairly close together to create that chevron stitch that goes in 2 directions. So this is one of those times where I have to be in the mood to be paying attention to all my stitches. If I start daydreaming, things could get less organized, to use a non-judgmental word there. And I'm just going back and forth, until I've finished the bottom half of the lips. And then when the bottom lip is done, I will repeat the same thing as a mirror image on the top lip. So now I have to think about which direction the stitches were going on the bottom lip and do the opposite on the top lip. And I will repeat again, this is definitely challenging. This is definitely jumping in with both feet without a safety net. So if this is too complicated, you could absolutely do something similar with just straight stitches and it will still look good. But if you really are up for a challenge and you feel like running stitch is not challenging enough, it's too simple for you, then here you go. Here's something that's not at all simple or trivial. So there are my finished lips, but remember I said that the outline is looking a bit scruffy. Well, there are ways to make the outline less scruffy. Well, here's where I'm going to work on that. So I've rethreaded my needle with the same darker red that I used for the outline in the first place, and I'm doing what's called a whipped double running stitch, and that means that I am taking my needle and wrapping each of those stitches, whipping around each of those stitches, around and around and around. I'm not going through the cloth, I'm just going around the stitches. And you'll notice that I'm using the wrong end of the needle so that I'm less likely to pierce the fabric, and I can just go around the stitches, around and around and around. And when I get all the way back to the beginning, you'll see that all those rough edges and any gaps in my stitches are smoothed out. And now I'm going to cut out my shape, making sure that I don't cut any of my stitches, and decide where I want to place it. And I like it coming off the end of these stitches here. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and perhaps I've inspired you to make something beautiful. Bye for now. I'll see you again soon.